The shuttle docked with a sound like glass settling into glass. Dr. Sarah Reeves pressed her palm against the window and watched Velthurian Academy rise out of the void. A constellation of pale blue spires growing from a moon-sized crystal, each tower lit from within as though something patient were thinking inside it. She had seen photographs. The photographs had lied. Nothing two-dimensional could prepare a human eye for the way the place seemed to hum very faintly in a register just below hearing. "First time," said the Tellurian envoy beside her, in the soft, clicking tongue her translator rendered as a librarian's whisper. "First human," Sarah said. "Yes, we are aware." The envoy did not say it cruelly. It said it the way one might inform a child that the cake on the counter was for someone else. She had been warned. The Velthurian Symposium accepted observers from younger species only once every 12 standard years, and no human had ever been one of them. Her invitation had arrived with a handwritten footnote from the Grand Chancellor herself. "Dr. Reeves, your dissertation on sedimentary feedback loops was charming. We thought you might enjoy watching real science." Charming. She had read that word 46 times on the long flight, and still could not decide whether to frame it or burn it. The disembarkation hall opened onto a corridor of living stone, and 3 Vithran scholars turned to watch her pass. They were tall, blade-thin, their skin the color of weathered marble, and their eyes, 6 eyes, in 2 delicate vertical rows, tracked her without blinking. She heard one of them murmur something her translator declined to render. "Welcome to the symposium, Earth Scholar," said a 4th voice, and a slim figure stepped from the shadows. "I am the Limmer, your assigned escort. Please refrain from touching the walls. They are alive and easily startled." Sarah managed a smile. "Noted." "You are also, regrettably, easily startled," the Limmer said. "I am told this is a human trait. Do try." The corridor opened into a vast amphitheater lit by hanging spheres of suspended gas. Hundreds of scholars from 7 civilizations were already seated, their bodies arranged in the careful geometries that polite alien company required. At the center of the chamber, suspended in a column of light, slowly rotating, was a hologram of a planet, gray-green, mottled with white, ringed by the broken rings of its own dead architecture. "Vethys 9!" Sarah's breath caught. She had read every paper ever published on the Crenari conjunction. She had argued about it with her advisor at 3 in the morning. She had dreamed about it, and now there it was, drifting above the heads of the only beings in the galaxy who were considered qualified to discuss it. A voice rose, smooth and ceremonial, from the dais. "For 40 cycles," the Grand Chancellor said, "we have studied the conjunction. For 40 cycles, our greatest minds have failed it. Today we begin again." The hologram shifted. Data streamed up its sides, atmospheric readings, radiation profiles, gravitational microfluctuations, structural failure logs going back 4 decades. Sarah's translator scrolled units she did not recognize, but the shape of the data, the rhythm of it, caught her eye and would not let go. The structural failures clustered, not randomly, in a tight, repeating window every 3 local years. She frowned. She frowned harder. There was something familiar in that shape. Something she had drawn on a whiteboard her first year of graduate school, then on a napkin at a conference in Reykjavik, then on the steamed window of her father's truck the winter she was 9, and he had explained to her, gently, why the bridge above their heads had a long metal seam running down the middle of it. "Dr. Reeves," the Limmer murmured, amused. "You are making a face." Sarah did not answer. She was looking at 40 years of unsolvable alien data, and somewhere underneath all of it, very quietly, she had just heard her father's voice say expansion joints, sweetheart. That's all. By the second day, Sarah had stopped trying to introduce herself. The pattern had become predictable. She would approach a cluster of scholars during the recess intervals, offer the careful 3-finger greeting the Limmer had taught her, and watch their conversation politely fold itself shut around her like a flower at dusk. They were not cruel. They were busy. She was, at best, a footnote at a wedding. So she did what she had always done when she felt small. She listened. The first speaker of the morning was Professor Ulankreth of the Suvani Academies, whose six-robed arms moved through the air in slow, theatrical loops as he spoke. His theory had a name, recursive lattice decay, and his slides were beautiful. Glowing equations bloomed and withered above the audience as he described how the very atoms of Vethi's 9 architecture were, he believed, falling out of phase with the planet's quantum substrate every 3 years. It was elegant. It was poetic. It explained nothing about why the failures always occurred between local months 4 and 7 and never in the polar settlements. The second speaker was Auditor Vell of the Crystalline Concordat, whose voice was a chord rather than a sound. She proposed dark resonance saturation, a hostile gravitational standing wave created by the interaction of 3 nearby gas giants. Her math was tight. Her diagrams were stunning. They did not explain why the failures preferred bridges and aqueducts over towers, or why the towers that did fail always failed at the seams. The third speaker proposed psionic interference from an unknown predator species. The fourth proposed exotic radiation from the planet's iron core. The fifth proposed that the colonists themselves were causing it through unconscious collective despair. That one got applause. Sarah wrote in her notebook, very slowly, in pencil, in English, where no translator would catch it. None of you have ever lived on a planet with seasons. She underlined it twice. She thought about her field trips as an undergraduate, standing on the cracked basalt of the Columbia River Plateau in October, listening to her professor explain why the rock looked the way it did. She thought about ice wedging, water seeping into a crack, freezing, expanding 9%, prying the crack wider, melting, refreezing, prying again, year after year, until a mountain became a valley. She thought about the highway she had grown up driving on, and the soft thunk-thunk of tires crossing the expansion joints every 50 feet, and her father saying if they didn't put those gaps in, the road would buckle in summer and crack in winter. She looked again at the Vethi's 9 hologram. The failures clustered in the local late spring, when the planet, on its long elliptical orbit, swung closest to its star and the surface temperature rose by nearly 60 degrees over the course of 3 months. The structures failed at their joints. The polar settlements, where the temperature swing was muted by ice cover, almost never failed. Sarah's pencil stopped moving. She sat very still for a long moment in the back row of the amphitheater, while a Suvani scholar argued passionately about quantum decoherence, and she felt something cold and bright move down the length of her spine. It wasn't possible. They were the most advanced minds in the galaxy, 40 years, 7 civilizations. But the Vethrans came from a tide-locked world. One face permanently sunward, one permanently dark, a temperate ring between them. No seasons, no daily temperature cycle, no expansion, no contraction. The Suvani lived in oceans beneath ice. Constant temperature. The crystalline concordat were crystalline. They didn't expand and contract, they regrew. The Tellurians lived underground. Every species in the room had evolved on a world where thermal expansion was either negligible, irrelevant, or so slow that it was a geological process, not an engineering one. They built their colonies on the assumption that materials behaved the way materials had always behaved for them. They had never, not in their entire civilizational history, needed an expansion joint. Sarah closed her notebook with hands that had begun, very slightly, to tremble. The limmer leaned over from the next seat, head tilted. "You are making the face again, Dr. Reeves." "The limmer," she said, very quietly. "I need to go to Vethi's 9. The escort blinked, all 6 eyes at once. "That is not on your itinerary." "I know," Sarah said. "Put it on my itinerary." Vethi's 9 smelled like iron and old rain. Sarah stepped off the survey shuttle in a borrowed environmental suit 2 sizes too long in the legs, and the wind hit her like a held breath. The sky was the color of weak tea. The sun, a small, hot, white thing, hung low over a horizon broken by the silhouettes of dead cities. The limmer had not come. The symposium had refused to authorize an escort for what the registrar called, with weary patience, the Earth Scholars' recreational excursion. They had given her a guide drone, a 4-hour oxygen reserve, and a return ticket. They had not given her permission to touch anything. She intended to touch everything. The first ruin lay an hour's walk from the landing pad, the remains of the Crenari Aqueduct, the structure for which the conjunction had been named. 40 kilometers of pale blue stonework that had once carried meltwater from the northern glaciers to the equatorial farms, now lying in pieces across the plain like a discarded spine. Sarah knelt beside the nearest segment. The stone was beautiful. The Vithran masons had cut it with a precision that human masons would have wept to match, every block fitted to its neighbor with a tolerance she could not have measured with anything in her kit. There were no mortar lines, no sealants, no gaskets, no gaps. She ran a gloved finger along the seam where 2 blocks met and felt nothing, no notch, no cushion, no allowance. The blocks were pressed together with the confidence of a people who had never once in their evolutionary history watched a stone get bigger in summer. She laughed quietly inside her helmet. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a person who has just realized that the joke is 40 years old and has been on everybody at once. She walked the length of the broken aqueduct and counted the failures. Every fracture occurred at a joint. Every fracture ran perpendicular to the long axis of the structure. Every fracture was wider at the top than at the bottom, the signature of a material that had been pushed against itself, hard, until something had to give. She climbed down into one of the breaks and found in the bottom of the gap a glaze of pale crystals. She knelt. She held her scanner over it. The readout came back in a language she had to translate twice. Salt! Not exotic alien salt, not quantum-entangled hypersalt. Sodium chloride with traces of magnesium and calcium. The kind of salt that crystallizes out of groundwater when the water freezes and is pushed out of the lattice. The same process that made the potholes outside her childhood home, the same process that made the cliffs of her undergraduate field site spall and crumble every March. She sat down in the dust of a dead alien aqueduct and laughed again. And this time the laugh was wet. It was frost weathering. It was thermal cycling. It was the water cycle and the rock cycle and the long, patient grammar of a planet with a tilted axis and an elliptical orbit, and 40 years of the galaxy's brightest minds had walked past it because they had never, not once, lived on a world that froze and thawed. She climbed back out of the break and stood in the wind and looked at the dead city on the horizon, and she thought about the colonists who had built it. They had been Vithran, mostly. They had built the way their ancestors had built, on a world that did not behave the way their world behaved, and they had watched it fail, and they had grieved, and they had asked the galaxy for help. The galaxy had given them theories. The galaxy had not given them a child's box of crayons and a kitchen sink and the words here, "Sweetheart, watch what happens when this freezes." Sarah Reeves stood up. She walked back to the shuttle with the wind at her back and a small clear vial of pale crystals in her gloved hand. And by the time she reached the landing pad, she had stopped trembling, and she was no longer afraid of anyone in the amphitheater. She had something to show them. "Absolutely not," said Registrar Velt. The registrar was a tall, thin Suvani whose 6 arms were currently arranged in the formal posture of polite refusal of an unreasonable request. Sarah had learned the posture on the flight in. She had not expected to be on the receiving end of it before her 3rd day. "I am formally requesting a presentation slot," she said again. "I have new findings on the Crenari conjunction." "Earth Scholar," the registrar's voice gentled, which somehow made it worse. "The symposium presentation slots are reserved for scholars of recognized standing within the concordant sciences. You are an observer. Your findings, whatever they are, may be submitted in written form to the post-symposium archive, where they will be reviewed in due course by whom? In how many years?" 11. Sarah closed her eyes. Registrar Velt, People are dying on Vethi's 9. The next conjunction is in 14 months. We are aware. I can stop it. The registrar's 6 arms shifted into a new posture, one Sarah did not recognize. It was, she would later learn, the Suvani equivalent of "I am about to be embarrassed on your behalf." "Earth scholar," Velt said very kindly. "Many have said so." Word traveled fast in a building where the walls were partly alive. By the evening meal, Sarah's request had become a rumor. By the morning session, the rumor had become a joke. She walked into the amphitheater on the 4th day to a low rustle of amusement that her translator did not bother to render, and she took her seat in the back row and opened her notebook and did not look up. She heard her name 3 times. She did not look up. She heard the word "charming" once. She did not look up. At the midday recess, the limmer slid into the seat beside her. The escort was carrying 2 cups of the warm violet liquid the Academy served instead of coffee, and offered Sarah one without speaking. Sarah took it. Her hands, she noted with detached interest, were perfectly steady. "The Grand Chancellor has heard your request," the limmer said. And she has granted it." Sarah's head came up. The limmer's 6 eyes were unreadable. "It is, you should understand, an act of mercy. She was charmed by your dissertation. She wishes to allow you the dignity of presenting before you return home. The slot is the final one of the symposium, tomorrow evening, after the closing remarks." "After," Sarah repeated. "After." It was the slot reserved, traditionally, for student exhibitions and ceremonial farewells. It was the slot in which no one was expected to say anything important. It was the slot, Sarah understood, in which a visiting human could be allowed to speak without anyone having to take her seriously. She took a long sip of the violet drink. It tasted like salt and flowers. "The limmer," she said. "I need to send a message to my hotel. I need someone to bring me a few things from the Colonial Supply Depot." "What things?" Sarah pulled a page from her notebook and began to write. A length of iron rebar, 2 meters, a propane torch, a clamp stand, a glass beaker, a liter of distilled water, a freezer unit portable, a block of the same pale blue Vithran masonry, stone they sold as souvenirs in the Academy gift shop, fist-sized, please, with a natural seam if possible, a hammer. The limmer read the list. The limmer read the list again. "Earth scholar," the escort said carefully. "What are you going to do?" Sarah folded the page and pressed it into the limmer's lower left hand and smiled. For the first time since she had stepped off the shuttle with all of her teeth. "I'm going to teach a science class," she said. That night she did not sleep. She sat on the floor of her quarters with the borrowed materials laid out around her in a careful semicircle, and she practiced. She practiced lighting the torch. She practiced the timing. She practiced the words she would say in her translator's most neutral register, the words a teacher says to a child the first time the child does not believe that ice is stronger than stone. At dawn, she showered. She braided her hair. She put on the one good blazer she had brought from Earth. She walked into the amphitheater for the last time, carrying a suitcase and a hammer. The hall fell quiet as she passed. She climbed the steps to the dais. The amphitheater held 4,000 scholars, and not one of them was looking away. They were not looking at her exactly. They were looking near her, the way a dinner party looks near the child who has been allowed to perform a song before bed, fond, indulgent, already half rehearsing the kind word they will say afterward. The Grand Chancellor sat in the high seat at the back, her long, pale hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Sarah set her suitcase down on the dais. She did not turn on the holographic display. She did not load any slides. She opened the suitcase and began, slowly, to unpack it. A length of iron rebar, a clamp stand, a propane torch, a glass beaker, a bottle of water, a small, humming portable freezer, a block of pale blue Vithran stone, fist-sized with a natural seam, a hammer. A faint ripple of laughter moved through the front rows. Sarah ignored it. She walked to the edge of the dais, and she spoke without notes, and her translator carried her voice into 4,000 pairs of ears in 41 languages, and her voice was very steady. "My name is Sarah Reeves," she said. "I am a geologist. On my world, what I am about to show you is taught to children before they are 9 years old. I am sorry it has taken so long to bring it to you." She turned to the clamp stand and fixed the rebar in it. She lit the torch. "This," she said, "is iron, the same alloy used in the central trusses of the Cranari aqueduct. I am going to heat it." She played the flame along the bar. The hall was utterly silent. "In approximately 90 seconds, Sarah said, "this bar will be longer than it was when I started, not by much. Roughly 1 part in 1,000 for every 100 degrees. On this scale, you will not see it. On the scale of a 40-kilometer aqueduct across a 60-degree seasonal swing," she paused, and her translator paused with her, and 4,000 scholars leaned forward by the smallest of fractions. "It is approximately 24 meters. A sound moved through the amphitheater. It was not laughter. She set down the torch. She picked up a caliper. She measured the bar. She showed the reading to the front row. She measured it again 90 seconds later after it had cooled. She showed that reading too. The numbers were small. The numbers were undeniable. "On my world," she said, "we have known about this for 400 years. We build every long structure, every bridge, every railway, every pipeline, every dam with gaps in it. We call them expansion joints. They allow the structure to grow and shrink without tearing itself apart. A child can see one by walking onto any highway overpass on Earth and looking down at her feet." She turned to the block of Vithran stone. "This," she said, "is the second half of the problem." She filled the beaker with water. She poured the water carefully into the natural seam of the stone until the seam was full. She placed the stone in the portable freezer. She closed the lid. She set a timer. While the timer ran, she spoke. She spoke about water, about the strange, almost unique property of water that, when it freezes, it expands by 9%. About how that expansion exerts a pressure of nearly 150 megapascals on whatever surrounds it. About how on her world, every spring, every cliff face and every roadway and every untreated stone wall is slowly torn apart by it. About how her people had named the process frost wedging before they had named the stars. She spoke about Vethi's 9, about its elliptical orbit, about its tilted axis, about the seasonal temperature swing of nearly 60 degrees that no Vithran engineer had ever felt on the world of their ancestors because their world did not tilt and did not freeze. About the pale crystals she had found in the broken seam of the Cranari aqueduct. The timer chimed. She opened the freezer. She lifted out the block of Vithran stone, and she set it on the dais, and she picked up the hammer, and she did not need to use it. The stone fell apart in her hands along the seam, neatly, as if it had been waiting 40 years to do so. The amphitheater did not breathe. Sarah Reeves looked up from the broken stone, and she met the eyes of the Grand Chancellor 4,000 seats away, and she said very quietly, "Build the joints, drain the seams before winter, that's all." The silence held for 9 seconds. Sarah counted them. She had read somewhere that the longest recorded silence in the Velthurian amphitheater had been 7. She thought about her father and the bridge and the long metal seam, and she counted. On the 10th second, the Grand Chancellor stood up. The Grand Chancellor of Velthurian Academy was 8 feet tall and 340 years old, and she had presided over the symposium for the last 60 of those years. And she had never, in any record any scholar could later find, descended from her seat during a presentation. She descended now. She walked the length of the amphitheater in the absolute hush of 4,000 held breaths, and she climbed the steps to the dais, and she stopped in front of Sarah Reeves, and she looked for a long moment at the broken stone. Then she knelt. It was a gesture. Sarah would later learn that the Grand Chancellor of Velthurian performed exactly twice in her career, once at her investiture and once at her death. Sarah did not know this at the time. She knew only that an 8-foot-tall alien matriarch had lowered herself to one knee on the dais beside her and was picking up the 2 halves of the Vithran stone with infinite care, and was turning them in her long, pale hands and was crying. The crying was very quiet. Vethrans cried from the inner corners of their eyes in slow silver tracks. The Grand Chancellor did not wipe them. "How long?" she said, in a voice that the translator did not need to soften. "Has your species known this?" 400 years, Sarah said. "And the freezing of the water? Longer, thousands. We learned it from watching our cliffs." "Cliffs," the Grand Chancellor repeated, as if tasting the word. "On my world there are no cliffs. The light does not move. The stone does not split." "I know," Sarah said. The Grand Chancellor nodded slowly and stood up, and she turned to face the amphitheater, and she lifted the two halves of the broken stone above her head so that every scholar in every row could see them. 40 years, she said. The amphitheater did not move. 40 years, and a child of Earth has done it in 4 days with a torch and a freezer and a hammer she did not need. Mark this carefully. We have built our sciences on the assumption that the universe behaves everywhere the way it behaves at home. We have been wrong. We will be wrong again. The next time a younger species sits in the back of this hall with her notebook closed, you will ask her what she sees. She lowered the stone. She turned back to Sarah. "Dr. Reeves," she said, "the symposium is yours." There were no closing remarks that evening. There was only a long, slow procession of scholars filing past the dais, each one stopping to look at the broken stone, each one nodding, some bowing, a few, the Vethrans mostly, pressing the inner corners of their eyes with their long, pale fingers and saying nothing at all. The limmer was the last in line. The escort stood in front of Sarah for a long moment, all 6 eyes very steady, and then folded its 4 lower arms in a posture Sarah had not yet learned. "It is the gesture," the limmer said before she could ask, "for I was wrong and I am grateful. It is rarely used." "The limmer?" "Earth scholar, Sarah." The escort's voice was not quite even. "On Vethys 9 there are 11 million colonists. In 14 months the conjunction would have come again. Bridges, aqueducts, the dome over the southern city. We would have lost, we would have kept losing, and we would have written more theories. You should know this. You should carry this home with you." Sarah carried it home. She carried it on the shuttle and on the long jump back through the relay gates and through the customs hall at Lagrange Station and into the small apartment in Cambridge where her cat had been fed by a neighbor and her plants had mostly survived. She set her suitcase down by the door. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and she opened her notebook, and on a fresh page in pencil in English she wrote, "Ask the children what they see." She underlined it twice. Outside, the first hard frost of October was settling on the windows, and somewhere in the long grammar of the planet, water was finding its way into a crack and waiting.